The Rebel Capitalist Show.
Back in quote unquote normal times,
Right.
when the market's rational, if you look at a balance sheet, the asset is the property,
Right.
and the liability is the debt. But now I think it's almost switched, where the property is actually the liability because prices are very high. I know you think that they're going higher, but they're still pretty expensive, relatively speaking.
Right.
But the debt, if you get a fixed rate 30-year mortgage, is incredibly cheap. And I think people will increase their purchasing power more for the next 10, 20 years through owning the debt than they will by owning the property. And I know that's a concept that's really difficult for people to get their mind around. So what I did is I called you this morning. I said, hey man, let's go through your concept of inflation-induced debt destruction, because you've got all these awesome charts, these slides that will really help people understand why, if they have a 3% mortgage as an example, and inflation runs higher than 3%, at 5%, 10%, let's say we get the 1970s, that's a transfer of wealth from the lender to the borrower. So that's why Jason's here, and he's going to help us understand that completely.
Yeah, George, you're absolutely right. And, kudos to you for recognizing this so long ago. Very few people really recognize this concept that I call inflation-induced debt destruction. I actually trademarked that phrase years ago, and it's true because most people don't see this hidden wealth creator, and it would apply to a lot of other assets besides real estate or besides income property if those other assets had the same characteristics that income property does, but sadly they don't. Income property is in a class by itself because it's multidimensional, it's unique in a lot of ways, and that's why it's the most historically proven wealth creator in the world, in my opinion. And
And
so
also,
the debt,
just use it for the people who are kind of more macro guys and gals. That having a 30-year fixed rate mortgage right now is a way to short the dollar.
Right, absolutely.
In simple terms, you're shorting the dollar. So
Right.
I know a lot of people, and I just spoke to a few of the members of my Rebel Capitalist Pro program last night, and they're talking about being very, very worried because they've got $200,000-$300,000 and sometimes more in cash.
Mm-hmm.
And like, man, I really am worried because I'm losing purchasing power due to inflation. And so what do I do? And then they went on to say that they actually own a lot of real estate. They're real estate investors, and they've got quite a few properties that they own with a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. And I said, guys, let's think about this. I'm not saying don't be worried about your cash position,
Right.
but I'm saying you should be a little less worried because you've got these properties where you're shorting the dollar through those 30-year fixed rate mortgages that give you kind of a counterbalance.
Right.
And I never even thought of it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's another reason why understanding this is so important.
Yeah, it is. And if they have a lot of equity in those properties, that's pretty much like having cash in the bank. That will lose purchasing power with inflation, but the debt will gain purchasing power vis-a-vis inflation. So as I've always said, another technique that I've shared with your viewers on your show over about a year ago was my refi till you die strategy.
Yeah,
and
right.
You want to keep these properties appropriately levered up. Use an appropriate amount of leverage always, and through time refinance them so that you get more inflation-induced debt destruction, as long as interest rates are low, and they are artificially very low, and as long as you can maintain a neutral or positive cash flow position. In fact, I would even argue that there's a strategy I used to talk about years and years ago, but it's not really applicable anymore because the lenders won't let you do it. But I call it the deferred down payment strategy. So we won't go into that, but I just like leverage. I jokingly, kind of snarkily say debt is my favorite 4-letter word. And, As long as it's good debt, good mortgage debt. I mean, I don't have any other debt except mortgage debt. Consumer debt is obviously terrible. It's too expensive. Student loan debt is a ripoff. But mortgage debt at incredibly cheap rates is actually quite a bargain, and people should take advantage of that. Yeah.
So let's go through the numbers so people can really get their head around what we're talking about, and they can see. I do a lot of podcasts as well, and they say, George, let's keep it super simple. What's 2 or 3 things that the average Joe or Jane can do? And I always say, have a little gold and silver. Might want to buy some Bitcoin or something like that as a speculation. But if you've got a house, regardless of whether it's a rental property or not, just make sure you got a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. It's the easiest thing people can do to take advantage of consumer price inflation if you're someone that believes that's what we're going to have over the next 10, 20 years.
Well, I think we're already having a significant amount of it. I mean, especially, with the cerveza sickness the past year, a whole bunch of prices have gone up of just tons of things. But we don't even need to get into that. But, one of the things that I think it's hard for people to grapple with, and you mentioned this off air, is this idea of a wealth transfer. And, you can benefit from a wealth transfer even if you don't get a check for it. Okay. People have to understand that wealth is constantly being moved around and transferred from one group to another, one person to another, one entity to another. And in this case, with inflation-induced debt destruction, mortgages or wealth is being transferred from the lender to the borrower, but the borrower doesn't really notice it most of the time until much later. They don't even understand why they got wealthy. And let me give you the example of my mother, okay, before we get into the numbers here, because in 1976, she purchased her first home, okay? And she used to say that she never thought she could make that mortgage payment. It was so expensive. It was in Los Angeles where I grew up. And, it's an expensive home now. And I guess maybe relatively it was expensive then at $62,500. Okay. In West Los Angeles, if you can believe that. Not a great area of West LA, but still West LA, zip code. And, her mortgage payment back then was $416 per month. Okay. And she used to tell me about how that payment felt, over the years. The payment didn't change. And so even 5 years later, by 1981, and 10 years later, by 1986, she was still writing a check for the same amount, $416 a month. But it felt much cheaper over time.
And let me chime in there. And the reason it did is because her income was going up with the rate of inflation, or maybe a little bit higher. But most people's income will go up sometimes it lags. I totally get that. But if it's going up, or your rents are going up with the rate of inflation, then that mortgage payment stays the same. And that's the delta that you're talking about.
Absolutely. Now, I don't know about her income per se, but statistically at least, and of course you know this all too well, from 1977 until about 2016, in real dollar terms, the typical American worker did not have a raise.
Correct.
They actually, their pay actually went down.
Slightly, but it's still going up considerably in nominal terms.
In nominal terms, yeah.
Cool. So let's go over the numbers so people can really see what we're referring to.
So let's go back to 1 year after we went off the gold standard. Okay, now this year is the 50-year anniversary of Nixon's infamous speech where he closed the gold window, right? and he said he was going to suspend temporarily, and I quote, the convertibility of the dollar to gold. And
it's still temporarily suspended.
Half a century later,
they've never officially just severed ties. It's still supposed to be temporary.
Right. Yeah, it's you can't make this stuff up. Milton Friedman, one of my favorites, and probably yours too. He said, "There's nothing so permanent as a temporary government program."
So, that's right. That's right. So true, isn't it?
So let's go back to 1972, and the interest rate on a 30-year mortgage right in the middle of 1972 was 7.37%. And the median house price was 18,267. Okay. And if you got an 80% loan and put 20% down on that house, you would have borrowed $14,000 and change. I'll just round off for speed. Okay. So that's the deal, right? You bought this house, 1972. You got a mortgage for a little over $14,000. You paid 7.37% interest for 3 decades, fixed rate. Okay. And when you started back in 1972, a dollar was worth a dollar because we didn't have any inflation, yet to report. Okay. So as you go through time, though, that dollar declines in value because of inflation.
Because rents and incomes are going up with inflation, or even slightly less, but they're still going up as a result, right?
Right. They are indexed to some degree or another to inflation. It might be a little lower, a little higher, but it's right around there. Now, the example we're talking about today, George, is a home that someone lived in. It's not a rental property. And we're taking this completely out of the idea of the, ivory tower. This is not a theory. It's not some esoteric exercise. It happened to millions of people. This is not a theory. It really happened. Okay. So every year, these people would pay $1,211 in 12 mortgage payments of $101 per month. Right. Okay. That's, if you borrow 80% at 7.37%, you'd pay $101 a month. That's the mortgage payment. Okay. Now let's fast forward to a year that the famous book George Orwell wrote back in 1948. The book was called 1984. Okay. Yeah. And so if we go to 1984, that same $1972 is now only worth 40 cents.
Right.
But that homeowner is still writing checks every month for $101 for their mortgage payment. Mm-hmm. So the nominal amount of the check, what it says on the check, is still $101, but the value of that $101 has declined to only $41. Mm-hmm. So, like my mom's example, that payment felt a lot lower. It felt much more affordable 12 years later.